again. These are my notes on Chapter 4, which is called American Life in the 17th Century. The chapter opens up on a bit of a gloomy note, talking about how all the people that lived in the Chesapeake area kicked the bucket before they were even 20 years old. Eventually, however, the Chesapeake people begin reproducing and start popping out babies, and by 1700, Maryland is the third most populated colony. One of the pluses, though, of that area was that it was great for making tobacco. But tobacco also had a downside of being really shitty for the land, and so they run out of usable farmland very quickly. Thus, you've got a lot of single young men who are frustrated by the lack of land and the lack of bitches, and they rise up in what was called Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon was their leader, and he rose up against Governor Berkeley, and him and a bunch of these 20-year-old dudes actually chased him from Jamestown and burned the city. But then Bacon dies, suddenly, assumably cooked with a side of eggs, and the rebellion ends. Even this early in history, we start to see a lot of African slaves come over, and by the mid-1680s, black slaves outnumber the white servants. Colonies begin to issue slave codes that tied the master and the slave together for life. Included in these colonies were places like Virginia and South Carolina. For Africans in America, life is different depending on where you live. The South is terrible. There's a lot of disease and extreme heat, but the Chesapeake is a bit better because the slaves aren't so isolated and tobacco is somewhat easier to farm. Slave culture also begins to form during this time, and that's where we get things like the banjo and voodoo. In the South, the society is very monarchical, if that's a word. You've got the small, powerful planter families who are full of all these famous names like Lee and Washington. Then you've got the small farmers, who are the majority of people. After that are the landless whites, then the indentured servants, and on the bottom rung you have the slaves. New England, on the other hand, has fun things like fresh air and a distinct lack of disease and longer life expectancy, shit like that. Family in New England is seen as the center of life, but as usual, women have approximately 0 rights. New England towns were usually small villages, with the religion typically being Puritanism. The larger towns had places that provided education, and that's where we get Harvard and William and Mary, colleges like that. One of the really popular things back then was this type of preaching called a Jeremiad, which was basically like a very zealous speech that condemned everyone to hell. It caught on at first, but then people got kind of tired of hearing all the ways that they were going to burn in a fiery pit, and church membership started dropping. So the leaders got together and they made the halfway covenant, which is just about exactly what it sounds like. It widened the church community and allowed certain people, namely women, to become partial members of the church. And right when you think they're making a step in the right direction, boom, Salem witch trials. That happened in 1963, and it took them 21 fucking years to annul the convictions of the witches who were killed. Fucking Puritans, man. Anyway, New England as a whole was not very ethnically mixed, as the immigrants were turned off by the rocky soil and strict religion. The climate meant that slavery wasn't really needed, and New England just naturally fell into becoming a place for shipbuilding and commerce. So overall, the early settlers were mainly farmers, women and men had set gender roles to follow, and already Americans were beginning to become disdainful of aristocracy and class distinction. And of course, that would later build into new chapters which will turn into the American Revolution. Have fun studying!